In 1902, a scientist in a Maine logging camp weighed every morsel 6 Canadian lumberjacks ate in a single work week. Those men burned nearly 7,000 calories a day swinging axes in frozen bush, and the foods that kept them standing have almost completely vanished from Canadian tables. Number 14 on this list was so essential that camp foremen would fire a cook who got it wrong. Number 3 created a chemical preservation method so effective that it fueled voyageurs, loggers, and fur traders across 3 centuries of Canadian wilderness. These 25 lunches were not fancy. They were carried in tin pails, wrapped in waxed cloth, and eaten sitting on felled spruce in -30. Before we start, hit subscribe, because what these men packed into the bush might change the way you think about food forever. Let us count them down. Number 25, salt pork on bread. Before refrigeration reached the timber limits of Ontario and Quebec, salt pork was the undisputed king of the Canadian bush lunch. Camp supply wagons hauled barrels of it up frozen tote roads every November, enough to last a crew of 40 men through to spring breakup. A logger would slice a thick slab of brined pork belly, lay it across 2 slices of bread baked that morning in the cookhouse, and wrap the whole thing in a square of cotton cloth. By noon, the fat had softened just enough to spread into the crumb, salty and rich, the only warmth coming from the tea pail boiling over a slash fire. Salt pork cost the camp operator roughly 4 cents a pound in the 1890s, making it the cheapest source of calories in the Canadian Shield. Men ate it without complaint because hunger in the bush forgave everything. That dense, white fat was pure fuel, and a man swinging a broadaxe for 10 hours needed every gram of it. Number 24, bean whole beans. No food defined the Canadian logging camp more than baked beans. Cooks would dig a pit in the frozen ground, line it with hot coals from the cookhouse stove, and lower in a cast iron pot packed with white navy beans, salt pork, molasses, and mustard. The pot stayed buried overnight, the earth insulating it like a slow oven. By morning, the beans had turned dark, sweet, and impossibly thick. Loggers scooped portions into their tin lunch pails before heading into the cut. Eaten cold at midday, those beans held their flavor and stuck to the ribs like nothing else. A 1904 nutrition study out of the University of Maine confirmed what every Canadian camp cook already knew. Baked beans were the single most important food in the logger's diet, providing more calories per man per day than any other item on the table. The bean hole vanished when propane stoves arrived in the 1950s, but old-timers in the Ottawa Valley still swear nothing matches the taste of beans cooked underground. Number 23. Bannock. That simple flatbread made from flour, lard, baking powder, and water was the bread of the Canadian bush long before sliced loaves existed. Camp cooks mixed the dough in massive bowls and baked rounds in wood-fired ovens, or fried them in cast iron pans slicked with pork fat. Loggers carried wedges of bannock wrapped in cloth, breaking off chunks at lunch to soak up bean juice, or to eat plain with a smear of molasses. Indigenous peoples across Canada had been making bannock for generations, and the recipe passed naturally into logging camp kitchens where simplicity and durability mattered more than refinement. A 50-pound sack of flour cost about $1.50 in the 1890s and could produce enough bannock to feed a crew for a week. The bread kept for days without going stale in the cold air, making it the perfect bush food. You could stuff it in your Mackinaw pocket at dawn, and it would still be edible at noon, which is more than you can say for anything on a grocery shelf today. Number 22, molasses bread. When white sugar was scarce in remote camps north of Lake Superior, molasses did the heavy lifting. Camp cooks stirred blackstrap molasses into bread dough, producing dark, dense loaves that tasted faintly of burnt caramel and iron. A logger's lunch pail almost always held a thick slice, sometimes spread with lard, sometimes eaten dry. Molasses was cheap, about 20 cents a gallon in bulk, and it shipped well in heavy tin cans that survived the rough journey up tote roads. The bread it produced was heavier than white bread, but packed more energy per bite. That dark sweetness cut through the monotony of salt pork and beans, giving the midday meal a small moment of comfort in an otherwise brutal day. Number 21, boiled EGs. In camps that kept chickens or had supply lines reliable enough to bring eggs in by the crate, boiled eggs became a prized lunch item. A cook would boil 3 or 4 dozen before dawn, and loggers would pocket 2 or 3 alongside their bread and beans. The shell kept them clean, the cold did not ruin them, and the protein hit was immediate. In the Ottawa Valley camps of the 1880s, eggs cost roughly a penny each when bought in quantity from nearby farms. That was expensive by camp standards, so eggs were a luxury, not a staple. But when they appeared in the lunch rotation, men ate them fast and never complained. A boiled egg in a Mackinaw pocket, cracked against a cant hook handle at noon, was as close to a treat as the bush allowed. Number 20, fried pork and potato cakes. Leftover mashed potatoes from the previous night's supper were mixed with bits of fried salt pork, shaped into thick cakes, and cooked on the griddle until golden on both sides. These traveled well in a tin pail, staying dense and solid through a morning of hauling timber. The combination of starch and fat made them a calorie bomb, exactly what a man needed when the temperature dropped to -20 and the saws kept biting. Camps across New Brunswick and Quebec serve variations of this, some adding onion, some folding in leftover turnip. The basic idea was always the same: use what is left, waste nothing, feed the men. Number 19, dried apple slices. Before canned fruit reached the northern camps, dried apples were the only fruit most loggers saw between November and April. Supply companies shipped them in burlap sacks, lightweight and nearly indestructible. A handful tossed into the lunch pail gave a logger something sweet and tart to chew on between bites of salt pork and bread. Camp cooks also stewed them into sauce and baked them into pies, but it was the raw dried slices, leathery and concentrated, that loggers carried into the cut. In the 1880s, a pound of dried apples cost about 8 cents. Cheap enough to justify, precious enough to ration. Men would tuck a few slices into their shirt pocket and eat them one at a time through the afternoon, a small sweetness against the cold. Number 18, sourdough biscuits. This is where the camp cook earned his reputation. The cook was the highest paid man in a Canadian logging camp besides the foreman, and for good reason. A bad cook meant men quit. A good cook meant a full crew all winter, and nothing proved a cook's skill faster than his sourdough biscuits. Every serious camp cook kept a sourdough starter alive in a crock near the stove, feeding it flour and water daily like a living thing. The biscuits it produced were tangy, dense, and chewable for hours in the cold bush. Loggers carried 2 or 3 in their coat pockets alongside their salt pork. Camp operators paid cooks up to $45 a month in the 1890s when a common logger earned $20. The cook's assistant, called the cookie, hauled water, split wood, and sometimes carried the midday meal out to the men on a hand sleigh. But when the cut moved deep into the timber, men packed their own. And what they packed tells you everything about how Canada was built. Number 17, soupe aux pois. French-Canadian pea soup was the backbone of Quebec logging camps from the St. Maurice to the Saguenay. Cooks simmered whole yellow peas with salt pork, onion, and summer savory until the pot turned thick enough to hold a spoon upright. Loggers ladled portions into their pails where it congealed in the cold, becoming almost solid by noon. They ate it like porridge, spooning the dense mass straight from the tin, sometimes with a hunk of bread pushed into the center to soak it through. A bag of dried peas cost pennies and fed dozens. The salt pork gave it depth. The savory gave it soul. In Quebec camps, pea soup appeared at nearly every meal, breakfast included. It was more than food, it was identity. The Quebecois logger defined himself by his pea soup the way a Newfoundlander defined himself by fish. When men gathered in the bunkhouse after supper, stories were told in French, and the smell of tomorrow's pea soup already drifted from the cookhouse stove. Number 16, Ellard and sugar sandwiches. This sounds impossible to modern ears, but loggers in northern Ontario camps spread pure rendered lard on bread and sprinkled it with white sugar for a fast, dense lunch. The combination delivered an enormous calorie hit in a small package, exactly what a man burning 7,000 calories a day required. There was no pretense about nutrition. This was survival fuel, born of the same logic that made pemmican essential to the fur trade. Lard cost almost nothing because every camp butchered its own pigs or rendered fat from the salt pork barrels. Sugar was more expensive, but used sparingly. A thin dusting was enough. Men ate these without shame because the bush had its own rules about food, and the only rule that mattered was whether it kept you standing until the gut iron rang for supper. Number 15, corned beef from the tin. When the Canadian Pacific Railway pushed supply lines deeper into the bush, tinned corned beef became a staple of Western logging camps in British Columbia and Northern Ontario. A logger could crack open a tin at midday, slice the dense pink block with his pocket knife, and eat it cold on bread. The beef was salty, compact, and nearly indestructible. Tins stacked easily in the supply cache and survived months without spoiling. For camps that could not keep fresh meat through a long winter, tinned corned beef was insurance. It was not loved. It was not hated. It simply was, as permanent and unremarkable as the black spruce surrounding the camp. Number 14, the lunch pail tea boil. This was not a food, but a ritual so essential it shaped the entire midday break. Every logger carried a small tin pail, and at noon, they would scrape together a pile of dry bark and small sticks, strike a match, and boil water for tea right there among the stumps and slash. Black tea, strong enough to stain the tin, sweetened with a fistful of sugar. That hot drink was the only warmth a man got between sunrise and sunset in a Canadian winter. Camp foremen judged a crew's morale by how quickly the tea fires lit at noon. A slow fire meant tired men. A fast fire meant the crew still had fight in them. The tea itself was cheap, shipped in bulk wooden chests, but its value in the bush was beyond measure. It thawed frozen fingers, washed down cold beans, and gave men a reason to stop, sit, and breathe before the afternoon haul. Number 13, Johnny cake. Cornmeal flatbread baked on a griddle or in a shallow pan showed up in logging camps across the Maritimes and eastern Ontario. Thicker than bannock and slightly sweet from the natural corn sugars, Johnny cake held together well in a lunch pail and could take a beating without crumbling. Camp cooks added a splash of molasses to the batter and baked the cakes in sheets, cutting them into squares for the men to carry. In New Brunswick camps, Johnny cake with a slice of salt pork was considered a complete lunch. The cornmeal came in heavy sacks from mills in southern Ontario, and a single sack lasted weeks. The taste was plain, slightly gritty, and deeply satisfying when eaten cold in the bush with nothing but spruce and snow for company. Number 12, ployees. In the Madawaska region straddling New Brunswick and Quebec, Acadian loggers carried ployees, thin buckwheat pancakes cooked on one side only, into the timber stands. Made from buckwheat flour, wheat flour, and baking powder mixed with water, ployees were supple enough to fold around a piece of salt pork or a spoonful of cretins. They did not crack in the cold like regular bread sometimes did, and their earthy buckwheat flavor paired perfectly with the heavy, salty foods of the bush. Ployees were deeply regional. A logger from the Ottawa Valley would not have recognized them, but in Madawaska, they were as fundamental as breathing. Families had been making them since the Acadian settlements, and when those same families sent their sons into the winter camps, the ployees went with them. Number 11, cold boiled potatoes. Second pattern break. The economics of feeding a logging camp. Running a cookhouse for 40 men was an operation that would humble most modern restaurant managers, and the humble potato sat at the center of it all. Camp operators in the 1890s budgeted roughly 30 to 35 cents per man per day for food. Potatoes were the cheapest way to fill a man. Boiled the night before and tossed cold into the lunch pail, they weighed heavy and kept a logger chewing through the afternoon. A typical winter supply list included 300 bushels of potatoes per camp, hauled in by horse-drawn sleigh on ice roads built specifically for the season. Men ate cold potatoes with salt and a scrape of lard, or mashed them into leftover beans. The cook's power was absolute in the cookhouse. Talking during meals was forbidden. A man who complained about the food risked being thrown out the door into the snow. These rules existed because feeding that many men, that much food, 3 times a day in a log building with no electricity required discipline bordering on military precision. Number 10. Venison jerky. In camps close to good hunting grounds, fresh game supplemented the salt pork and tinned beef. But fresh venison spoiled fast, even in the cold. So the smartest camp cooks dried it. Strips of deer or moose meat were salted, peppered, and hung near the cookhouse stove until they turned dark and leathery. Loggers stuffed handfuls into their coat pockets for the walk to the cut. Chewed slowly through the morning, a piece of jerky could last an hour, releasing salt and protein in small doses that kept a man's energy steady between meals. In northern Ontario and Quebec, moose was more common than deer, and the jerky made from it was tougher but richer. The tradition linked directly to indigenous methods of preserving meat, knowledge that had sustained people in the boreal forest for thousands of years before a single pine was felled for market. Number 9. Cold tourtière slices. Quebecois loggers from the Lac-Saint-Jean region and the Mauricie carried slices of tourtière, that spiced meat pie made with pork, sometimes veal, and potatoes baked in a lard pastry crust. A cook might bake several large pies the night before, and men would wrap thick wedges in cloth for the next day's lunch. Cold tourtière held together beautifully. The lard in the crust kept it from drying out, and the spiced filling, heavy with clove, cinnamon, and savory, tasted almost better at room temperature than it did hot. In the camps, tourtière was a taste of home, a reminder of the Réveillon table and the kitchen your mother kept. For Quebecois loggers who spent 5 months away from their families, that slice of cold pie at noon was more than lunch. It was memory. Number 8. Sugar pie. Tarte au sucre showed up in Quebec bush camps as a dessert that doubled as a lunch item. Made from brown sugar or maple sugar, cream, and a simple pastry shell, sugar pie was dense, sweet, and packed with quick energy. A slim wedge in the lunch pail gave a logger a burst of fuel for the afternoon haul. The recipe varied from cook to cook and region to region, but the principle was always the same. Cheap sugar, cheap cream, cheap crust, and a sweetness so intense it could make a man forget he was standing in 3 feet of snow. Camp cooks who could bake a proper sugar pie were remembered by name decades after the camps closed. Number 7. Cretins on bread. This cold pork spread, seasoned with clove, cinnamon, and onion, traveled north from Quebec farmhouse kitchens into the logging camps of the Laurentians and beyond. Cooks would simmer ground pork with spices and breadcrumbs until it formed a thick, spreadable paste, then pack it into crocks that kept for weeks in the cold. Loggers spread it thick on bread or bannock, and the spiced fat carried a flavor so distinctive that men who grew up eating it could identify their mother's recipe blindfolded. Cretins cost almost nothing to make. A pound of cheap ground pork, a handful of spices, stale bread for body. It was peasant food in the truest sense, born of the same philosophy that drove every decision in the bush. Use everything, waste nothing, feed the crew. Number 6. Figgy Duff. Third pattern break. In Newfoundland, logging camps along the Exploits and Humber rivers, figgy duff was the pudding that kept men going. It was a boiled suet pudding, studded with raisins and molasses, steamed in a cloth bag until dense and dark. Loggers carried thick slices in their pails, and the heavy sweetness gave them a burst of energy when the afternoon cold set in deepest. But here is something nobody talks about: the silence rule. In most Canadian logging camps, talking during meals was strictly forbidden. The cook enforced it. 40 men in a cramped cookhouse had 15 minutes to eat. Conversation slowed things down. The silence had a side effect nobody intended. It made men pay attention to the food. When you could not talk, you tasted. You noticed the texture of the bread, the salt in the pork, the sweetness of the figgy duff. Old loggers recalled the silence rule decades later and said the food tasted better because of it. We eat now while scrolling phones and watching screens. Those men ate in silence, staring at their tin plates, and they remembered every meal. Number 5, vinegar pie. When lemons were impossible to find north of the rail line, camp cooks made pie with what they had. White vinegar, sugar, eggs, butter, and a dash of nutmeg in a plain pastry shell. The vinegar mimicked the tartness of citrus, creating a custard filling that tasted remarkably like something far more expensive. Loggers who had never seen a lemon in their lives ate vinegar pie without knowing what they were missing, and most preferred it to anything else the cook turned out. It sounds desperate, but it was ingenious. The acid from the vinegar reacted with the sugar and eggs to produce a smooth, tangy custard that set perfectly every time. A cook could make 6 pies from ingredients that cost less than $1 total. Slices went into lunch pails wrapped in wax paper, a sweet finish to the cold salt pork and beans that defined every midday meal. Number 4, smoked fish. In camps near the Great Lakes, along the rivers of northern Quebec, and across the vast waterways of British Columbia, smoked fish appeared in lunch pails with regularity. Whitefish, trout, and salmon were split, salted, and hung in crude smokehouses built from green logs and bark. The smoking preserved the fish for weeks, and the flavor it produced, deep, oily, and faintly sweet, was unlike anything a modern grocery store can replicate. Loggers peeled strips of smoked fish and ate them cold with bread, the oils keeping the meat tender even in freezing temperatures. In British Columbia's coastal camps, smoked salmon was so abundant it became ordinary, something men ate without thinking. But in the interior camps of Ontario and Quebec, smoked fish was seasonal and prized. When it appeared in the lunch pail, it meant someone had planned ahead, and planning ahead in the bush was the difference between a good camp and a miserable one. Number 3, pemmican. Long before logging camps existed, Indigenous peoples across Canada had perfected the ultimate survival food. Dried meat, usually bison, moose, or deer, was pounded into powder, mixed with rendered fat, and sometimes studded with dried berries. The result was a dense, calorie-rich block that could last for months without spoiling. Fur traders adopted it. Voyageurs depended on it. And when the logging frontier pushed north, pemmican followed. Loggers in remote camps where supply lines were unreliable carried pemmican as insurance. A fist-sized piece could sustain a man through a full day of heavy labor. The fat provided slow-burning energy. The dried meat supplied protein. The berries added vitamins that prevented scurvy. No modern energy bar comes close to the nutritional density of traditional pemmican. Food scientists have studied its composition and confirmed what Indigenous peoples knew for centuries. The combination of rendered fat and dried protein creates a preservation chemistry that inhibits bacterial growth almost indefinitely in cold conditions. We replaced it with granola bars and protein powder. The original was better. Number 2, donuts. The camp cook's donut was not the glazed ring you buy at Tim Hortons. It was a heavy, dense ball of fried dough rolled in sugar while still hot and piled in mountains on the cookhouse table. Loggers grabbed fistfuls for their lunch pails. Those donuts traveled beautifully in the cold, never going stale, the sugar crust sealing in moisture. A single donut packed roughly 400 calories of pure energy, and most men carried 3 or 4 into the bush each morning. The best camp cooks were judged as much by their donuts as by their bread or beans. A perfect camp donut was crisp on the outside, tender inside, and sweet enough to make a grown man close his eyes for a second. In the Ottawa Valley, stories circulated about legendary cooks whose donuts drew entire crews to their camps. Foremen used the promise of a good cook the way modern companies use signing bonuses. The donut was currency, morale, and fuel all rolled into one golden ball of fried dough. When the camps closed and the men went home in spring, it was the donuts they talked about. Not the danger, not the cold. Donuts. Number 1. The full tin pail. This is not a single food. It is the entire assembly. The lunch pail itself, a tin bucket with a wire handle and a fitted lid, carried everything a Canadian logger needed to survive from dawn to dark in the coldest workplace on earth. Bread on the bottom, a slab of salt pork or cold meat, a scoop of beans pressed into one side, 2 donuts wedged on top, maybe a piece of pie or a handful of dried apples tucked into the gaps. The lid sealed tight to keep out snow and sawdust. The pail hung from a belt or a branch near the cut, and at noon, men gathered around their slash fires, opened their tins, and ate in the same disciplined silence they had learned in the cookhouse. That tin pail fed the men who built this country. Every railroad tie, every ship mast, every board in every farmhouse, from Halifax to Vancouver, started with a man in the bush eating cold beans from a tin bucket. The food was plain, the work was brutal, but the system worked, and for over a century, the Canadian logging camp lunch sustained an industry that shaped the nation. Try packing one of these lunches yourself. Cold pork on bread, baked beans from a pot, a donut rolled in sugar, eat it outside in February. Then come back and tell me if those loggers were wrong about anything. Share which one surprised you most in the comments. And if your grandfather worked the camps, I want to hear what he carried in his pail.